mics. What's the story?
They asked me to turn on the mic, but I don't think we need it. Now it's on. We can try it.
I need this. Where am I supposed to go? I'm just... How are we going to face each other? Yeah, this is not... We need a coffee table. And some unusual setting. The order. Are you sitting in specific orders? Or
I think you're sitting right there. That's as far as I know.
Yeah, one second.
We don't want you to pull your chair out because you gotta be in view of the live stream. Think that out.
Alright. And that means I can't use the podium. Ordering out. I know, I hate that.
Because of the live streaming.
Okay.
So we just want.
You think there's people out there?
Well, I don't know.
They're at home. They're actually in the house. That's right, and it's 30% of your final mark. I failed. Nicole is giving me this thumbs up. That must mean something is happening. I'm supposed to start? Oh, yeah. You know, at moments like this, total tabula rasa. I don't remember what was supposed to be said. Let me just warn everyone, we're streaming live. We think this is going into policy wonk bars all over Brooklyn. I want to thank you all for coming. We thought it was going to rain, didn't rain, that held off, but you still braved the G train. Not so bad. My thanks to Citibank Community Development, one of the sponsors, to Con Ed, and Joari Jenkins is back there. Wave. Thank you for being one of our sponsors. And of course to Pratt Institute, who not only helps us financially in this space, but providing us with graduate level fellows who thank God that they're here for us to exploit them mercilessly and to keep our costs down. And a big, Nepal is leaving, but she was about to get a big shout out to thanking Team Pratt for Nepal and Sal and Marie and everyone who helped make this possible. So thank you all very, very much. Okay. So, hi, we're here from the Pratt Center. We're here to help. You all kind of know why we're here, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the mission statement to build a more just and equitable city by providing TA to community groups. I think you all got that. And you know that this is part of our 50th anniversary. That's not completely true. It's more like our 51st or 52nd. It's taken us a real long time to get it together. And it's not that we didn't have something that we wanted to celebrate. We think we have a lot to celebrate. But rather than do the tuxedo thing and honor people and do a lot of fundraising around that, we really wanted to do something substantive that would advance the practice. We're going to be talking about community development, but in truth, you know, we're kind of a community, and we're a community of practice. And we want to share some of the lessons learned and what we see that's evolving in our community so that we can all do a better job, you know, so we all can sort of share in building a more just and equitable future. So this is the kickoff of what will be a series of policy salons or forums, which we're calling Community Development 360. And this first one kicks off talking with some focus on sustainability and education, and how can we apply the tools of community development in that world, and what we learn from that, and how to have more robust institutions. And then there's going to be another one on April 30th, which is going to be moderated by Brad Lander, the second executive director, which is going to focus on economic development. And the third will be on June 4th, which Ron Shiffman is going to moderate, and it'll be on whatever he wants to talk about that evening. But we're sure it's going to be absolutely fabulous. So, but let me tell you a little bit about my day. Today was the Alumni Awards, the Pratt Alumni Awards luncheon. And Brad Lander, who went here and has a master's in urban planning from Pratt, was one of the honorees. And he was introduced, the award was presented by Ron Shiffman. And the two of them are absolutely fabulous, impassioned, articulate, soaring orators who have dedicated their lives to equity and sustainability and truth and justice, and over decades have built up this fabulous team of incredibly talented and mission-driven people. And they're talking about, you know, the great work and contribution that they've done in housing and parks and transportation, and really empowering communities, giving to communities the tools they need. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, Jesus Christ, I have to follow these two guys for the rest of my professional life? I am so screwed. And, you know, it's a challenge. But on the other hand, and they've set a high bar, right? And I firmly believe that the trick to being a good manager is to diminish expectations. But they have set expectations really high. On the other hand, by setting expectations really high, they've really given us some clear knowledge about where we need to go in this world. You know, and I think they've established a lot of clarity about how to judge what's the measure for our work, which has to do with how do we strengthen low-income communities by providing the technical tools that they know so they can have meaningful engagement in the decisions that affect their lives. So with that, let me thank you all for being here. Tell you all to turn off your phones if you already haven't. The format's going to be, we're going to do some introductions and some Q&A, and then it's really Q&A and comments. We really want this to be a discussion where we're all engaged in here with you all. So let me introduce the folks here. First of all, I guess I'll start with Wendy because she's on my right. Wendy is a Pratt Center alumni, as you all know, and really deserves a lot of credit for the work that we've done in thinking how to apply the tools of community development to sustainability around retrofitting wonderful family homes in low-income communities, and now as an independent consultant and the donor representative on the Change Capital Initiative, which is a collaboration of 17 foundations that are looking to foster best practice and show how they can have more impact, how CDCs can have more impact in their communities, particularly tackling the challenges around the growth and income disparity. More on that in a moment. And then we have Cecil Corbin-Mark, who is Deputy Director and Director of Policy for WEAC, which is the first environmental justice organization in New York City. One of the first in New York City, and also a board member of the Northeast Environmental Justice Alliance. And then we have Jack Doyle, who is Executive Director of New Salon Departments, which is a nonprofit housing and community service organization in the Mount Eden section of the Bronx, and who I recently got a tour from of what they do, and I was absolutely blown away by sort of the richness of the programming that they're able to provide in this community. So I think we have a lot to learn from what they've done. And finally, at the end, we have Douglas Manley, who is now Chief of Staff for the Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency, and prior to that was Director of Policy and Planning at AFI, and was responsible for a lot of the community-based planning that they've done. So, okay, we're at the moment where I'm supposed to do the framing paragraph. Here's the thing. It certainly feels to me like we are in a period of transition in the community development movement. And arguably, you know, that's just the nature of the beast. Community development, almost by definition, is always evolving and is always changing because communities have different priorities and things change over place and time. It's like this great big equation and the values change periodically. But I certainly have some sense that there is this seismic shift going on. And what I see it involved in is around climate change and income disparity. You know, this is post-Sandy, right? We've all been shocked into realization of what's going on. It's inescapable. I was at a meeting or a forum at which the mayor said something like, the people know what's going on. It's the leaders who are playing catch up. So that's a piece of the seismic change. And then the other, I think, has to do with the growth in income disparity. And we are now really feeling the impact of what it means to be a global city, where New York City is just awash in capital, and it's now, you know, spreading through the communities, and that's what we're seeing. A lot of the incredibly rapid displacement and gentrification in a lot of neighborhoods, I think, is really tied to these sort of tremendous mega forces, which have been gradually unfolding, but have now reached this critical mass or this threshold. In addition to sort of the programmatic changes, I think we're also seeing a change in process. And what's the nature of a community development organization to deal with the sort of programmatic changes, and how can we have more robust institutions to deal with sort of problems on this very grand scale. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys to say a little bit about, and why don't we start with Douglas and work this way, a little bit about what you're doing now, but what you've seen, you know, what are the challenges, and how community groups are responding to them. How did this occur around you at Acton?
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's a
Thank you.
privilege to be part of it. You know, when I used to work in HIV/AIDS when I was much younger, I always used to say I'm about as old as the AIDS crisis. Not quite as old as the CDC movement, but I'm happy to really contribute my experience, personally, professionally, kind of to this dialogue, for sure. Currently, in my role at the Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency, we're charged with working with communities throughout the 5 boroughs, working with our agency partners in city government, but also working with folks at the state and federal level to really roll out a vision for equitable recovery and long-term resiliency. So much of our work is rooted in responding to and really serving communities that are still impacted and displaced by Sandy, but also much of our work is looking forward around climate adaptation and, you know, the risks that we know are starting to evolve and probably look very different 50 to 100 years from now. It's in my role, it's a very administrative role, which is very different than the role I had at AFI, where I was doing more program development, fundraising, some organizing and planning projects. But I think I draw the distinction mainly to say that while they feel different day to day when I show up to work every morning, I think a lot of the experiences, and I think for myself and I think many of my colleagues, our rootedness in working in communities and coming from community development really speaks to the work we do day in, day out. So I'll probably bounce back and forth a bit. I'm only a couple months into my work at City Hall, so I'll probably bounce between my time at AFI and what I'm doing now. I think some of the challenges around community development are that there really this tension between, or not a tension, but there's a dynamic around kind of locally based organizations and the need to remain local and also the need to kind of grow and expand in scope. You know, I think what really inspired me to become part of this community development movement, to get a job doing it, was the fact that I really understood it to be around community control and self-determination of communities and really active. So it's not just about a service, a hand up, but it's really around changing the physical environment of a community and everything that kind of comes from that in an individual or family's life. And that's what I always try to remember, you know, during the tough times when we're just doing all the nitty-gritty, nuts and bolts stuff that we have to do in nonprofits or government. But I think that, you know, starting from the vision, whether organizations have started small, stayed hyper local, really investing in community development, or have hop skip neighborhoods, gone national, or kind of served many different constituencies, and have done many different things. I think it's, regardless of what type of organization you are, and the people who are driving the organization, it's, I think, a very interesting dynamic about and stay rooted in what we all really want to get done together. And sometimes organization politics get in the way, block politics get in the way, politics at City Hall get in the way, but that stuff is the fun things that drive each day. I think the challenge is for any given organization or anyone working in this field, what kind of work do you want to be doing? And how is that rooted in your own community, history of your organization, and how those two things really come into play?
Yeah, so when Adam was talking earlier, I guess three things were going through my mind. The first one was that maybe I should have gone to Pratt. The second one was actually looking out at the audience and knowing some people are here that maybe I should change places with some of you because I know a lot of you will have a lot to say. And I guess the third thing was that I wish I could, transport everybody right now to the Mount Eden neighborhood of the Bronx, so you can get a better picture of kind of what we're doing and what I'm going to be talking about. So, New Sutton Apartments actually, came into existence around 1990 and began with, the gut rehab of 14 buildings that were home to 895 families. And we've grown since to house 1,022 families in 17 buildings, but in a very concentrated neighborhood. So everything we do is very, very place-based, and it's kind of, it's the world I'm in, So some of these bigger global questions I have a hard time grappling with. But just to say a little bit about what we do and some of the things that I think that makes us unique is that we do housing, of course. We have a wide range of programs to serve youth and adults, and a lot of organizations that have housing also do that. But then also I think we're very proud of the fact that we have a very strong, substantial, well-regarded, and powerful community organizing arm. And we have, over a period of years, really focused our energies in two particular areas in our community organizing work. One, to address the gross inequities that exist in terms of public education in the city of New York, in our neighborhood, where when we first took a look at it, a school down the block, 17% of the children were reading at grade level, 83% weren't, and a lot of parents had no idea what that meant, and we made a big poster and it had 100 kids on it, and 17 of them held signs that said, I can read, and 83, I can't read, and then below it said, which of these children is yours? And it was kind of a way to begin to make people aware of what was going on. And since then, through our Parent Action Committee, which actually became a founding member of the New York Coalition for Educational Justice, we've continued to work to organize parents for collective action to try to claim for their children a decent education. And we see that as an essential part of the community development work that we're doing. The other organizing work we do really focuses on housing organizing throughout our neighborhood, and it's not simply organizing tenants in one building and another building and another building. It's, of course, what all of you can imagine, which is finding issues that impact families across many buildings, whether it's a common owner, different owners, and what that looks like, and how do we figure out ways to preserve the housing as affordable, combat displacement, combat so much of what goes on. And that's taken us to develop a whole housing court campaign, housing court reform campaign, which was through a participatory process of members coming together, community people doing 1,000 surveys at housing court, doing observations, focus groups, and along with the Urban Justice Center issuing a report, Tipping the Balance, which has begun to have some impact not only on housing court in the Bronx, but since it's one unified system housing court throughout the city. Small incremental changes, but some that we hope will be much more expansive. So I'm kind of more saying a little bit about our work. I hope that's okay. And then so it's the housing organizing, it's the services, and the organizing for education justice. And then I should say that our recognition of the problems that existed in the public schools kind of led us to quite a few years ago began planning to develop a school, two schools, and we decided our commitment was to ensuring that public schools, district schools, and demonstrating they can be effective, as they were for many people in the past, as they are right now for a select number of New Yorkers and their children. And so we went through a whole process that involved working with DOE, with the School Construction Authority, with Settlement Housing Fund, which we're affiliated. And in September of 2012, after multiple years of planning and putting together financing and building in September 2012, 172,000 square foot building, designed by Dattner, Goodman, Sutton, Knox and Wood, opened, and it houses the new Settlement Community Center, which has a beautiful indoor swimming pool and dance studios. We have a partnership with Alameda with the American Dance Theater, rooftop garden, and then 2 public schools as well. A public school that is a pre-K to 5, and another one that is a 6 to 12. And we're just 2.5 years into it, but we're very pleased with the academic achievement thus far. And it's not a screen school, it's not a select school, it's district choice. Anybody in the school district 9 can attend the school. So I guess that's just to kind of describe a little bit of, on the ground, how we envision the community development work.
So I just want to say to Adam that both Ron and Brad still put their pants on one leg at a time.
You know who originally said that? Mae West.
And I love Mae West. And so don't worry about those expectations. I think you'll do just fine. And thank you for having me here, and thank you to all of you for being here. The other thing I want to say is that you also talked about the mayor, who I like him a lot. And I think, however, he needs to be encouraged to take the phrase that he used and sort of go a little bit deeper. And what I mean by that is that he is right that people in communities know what's going on, and they really have a very clear sense of things that are needed, especially on the ground in their local communities. The thing that I think wrong in that statement that you sort of offered as his, and if you didn't get it right, I'll blame it on you, Adam, is that it's not necessarily our leaders that have it wrong, because my firm belief is that the leaders in our system and in our society are really the people in the communities. And those who think otherwise are often the ones that get it sort of confused. The folks who are in public service are critical and important and are, essential to the smooth functioning of our government, and sometimes not so smooth, but they are not the leaders from my perspective and given the work that we do. Some of them sometimes play the role of rulers, which are the worst kinds, and there's a very big distinction for me. My grandmother used to say, and my great aunt says this too, and she just turned 100 years old, so she's got wisdom. That leaders are people who 99% are doing things, and 1% are, thinking of things. It's like, it's about work, and that's where leadership comes from. They set examples and so forth. So I won't go on about that, but I think we need to correct him on that, and I think he'll accept that as a friendly amendment to his comment. My name is Cecil Corbin-Mark, as Adam said. I work for an organization that is entering its 26th year. Like you, we are, we celebrated like our 25th anniversary, our 26th year, so this would make us our 27th year. I'll get the math right soon. And we are about building healthy communities. And the way that we see that we can create change from some of the unhealthy communities that we live in is by really engaging the members of our communities, particularly where we come from, it's northern Manhattan, in really helping to shape and frame some of the policies, injecting that sort of knowledge that I just talked about as being possessed by people who live in communities and on the ground, that knowledge really helping to shape what our policies look like. I think because those leaders have been disconnected from the process of making policy, we have found ourselves in a hot mess. We, as an organization, build healthy communities by focusing on 8 key areas. I won't run through all 8 of them. I'll give you our top priorities. That's working on clean air. It's working on climate justice. It's working on sustainable land use. It's working on healthy indoor environments. And we've just launched a new initiative around green jobs, or really returned to initiative of building sort of green jobs for people in our communities. I think that by putting those people in a position to help drive policy in our city, that we will begin to be able to turn some of this mess around. We have to build, I think, the civic musculature of those on the ground in communities who are on the front lines of particular kinds of climactic crises, much like what we've experienced in the last couple of weeks. We have to build the musculature for those folks to exercise power and to really help in shaping the policies that sort of govern our everyday lives. And that's the work that we've been engaged in, whether it's around reclaiming a garbage marine transfer station at 135th Street that we organized residents to work with Mayor Bloomberg to keep it closed, and now working with Mayor Blasio to implement a community vision about how that facility will be repurposed, or whether it's through our that's our Trash to Treasure campaign, or whether it's through our Northern Manhattan Climate Resiliency Initiative, where we're specifically targeting and looking to engage the voices of low-income communities in sort of the policy process of what climate resilience looks like. And for them, that doesn't mean only talking about how we harden the subways or how we think about sort of, possibly building structures that will sort of prevent the next wave from taking over our coastlines, because we know whatever structures we build will ultimately have a place where they end. And that place where they end generally will be low-income communities and communities of color. There won't be Wall Street, right? We can all agree to that, right? I come from a black church. I need a little call and response. Just checking that you're here. We're all in this 360 conversation together, right? Or whether it's our Healthy Homes campaign, where we're working with amazing organizations across the city, like Urban Justice Center, or Make the Road by Walking, or Northern Manhattan Improvement Corporation, to really develop sort of asthma-free homes legislation in Intro 385, a bill that is introduced in the City Council. I encourage you all to look out for it. We've got 35 co-sponsors on it. So those are the types of things that we do. We do our work through a model of engaging in community-based organizing. We're a membership-based organization. We also recognize that because for so long community residents have been divorced from the policymaking process, their credibility when they raise issues in that policymaking process is often suspect. And so to bolster what local folks already know and to put it into language that is easily translatable by policymakers, we work with researchers. And it's taken a little while to train them up right, but we have successfully managed some partnerships with Columbia University School of Public Health and Mailman School, Mount Sinai, and a number of others. And through those partnerships, we believe that we gain data and other kinds of research information that will help us make the policy cases that we are engaged in. And we also, lastly, do our work through advocacy. Like I said, we believe that all of our organizing is about engaging people in policy campaigns that are evidence-based. And that evidence is in part the evidence that they bring to us through our organizing, but it is also in part the evidence that we are gaining through our research partnerships with others. And so that's how we do our work. In terms of one of the biggest challenges that I think community development is facing, I think like many sectors many moons ago, community development essentially became siloed into a particular discipline that meant specific things. And for some that meant that we needed to build housing. For some, they began to think a little more holistically about what a community could look like, and they began to expand and recognize that we needed some level of economic development. For some, I think those that are getting it even better in terms of what community development from my perspective is all about, have begun to think about things like education, like Mr. Doyle just spoke about, which I think is incredibly powerful, or organizing tenants around common issues. I know that's something that AFI did and does, right? And so I think that the organizations that are becoming more sort of centered in a more ecosystem kind of approach are the ones that are ultimately beginning to better understand what the picture of community development should be about. Some of them, I think, still have a way to go. Some of them, for example, when my organization starts talking to them about environmental health, right, and what it means to think about indoor environments as we build houses, what it means to think about energy use and energy consumption and how that's related to the fact that certain communities can turn on their lights even 3 days after a superstorm Sandy, a la Wall Street, while the rest of us, for example, were in darkness in certain parts of our city for months and months at hand. What it means, for example, for us to be thinking about health and asthma and how we think about what we're developing in communities around the city and how that plays a role in terms of affecting the health of residents, particularly as we talk about residents who may already be at particular clients and disadvantage in terms of their own existing health outcomes because of those very poor past policies that we might have put into practice. So I think that there are some people that are moving more in that direction. I know LISC, for example, is working on a number of initiatives that I think are very promising. They're sort of 2 shades of green is, I think, something that I think is a really interesting sort of model and example. You have Enterprise, of course, doing some of this work as well. They're the big kids on the block, and they get a lot of shine and a lot of attention, and they should. But I think that there are also small folks doing lots of really great things much closer on the ground to communities. And if you haven't gotten it just by yet, I'll just emphasize again that for me, the root of all of our ecosystems starts with the smallest part of it, right? When you think about the spiral in a shell, right? That spiral in that shell is equidistant from every part of it. And when you shape it or try to move it or change it in different ways and dimensions, it actually remains perfectly formed in equidistant settings from various points to one another in the spiral. I think that mirrors sort of the universe that we exist in, the solar system that we exist in. It's got this sort of perfect balance and setup. And even the smallest part of it is integral to the rest of it. And when we strengthen that smallest part, when we give voice and build the musculature of those on the ground communities to exercise power in the processes that govern our daily lives and set policies, I think we will have moved closer to the system of community development that will best serve us for the future.
Stole my notes, actually. And I never have thought about it before, but I'm actually a little bit older than the community development. So I have been consulting since I left Pratt about 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, and too many of you with Liz and your community trust and Pratt Center, and one of the big projects that I do is the Change Capital Fund, and some of our donors are here, and some of our grantees are here, so I too feel like we could easily switch places, so feel free to jump in if I'm misspeaking at any point. I've also been administrative for the New York City Housing and Recovery Neighborhood Donor Collaborative, and I did some work around the edges of the CDC 4G initiative, so I'll touch on all those things, and I should say that the sponsor is not liable for anything that I say. So I'm seeing a few things that are challenges to the community development field. One is, I think, its greatest asset is that it does, community-based organizations have ties to their neighborhoods and to the residents that live in them, and as Cecil said so eloquently. And yet, I think that is, and that's the reason that the groups are often tapped by government to be single-stop centers and to operate financial centers and to, respond after a Hurricane Sandy. That's taken in some ways for granted, that there are those ties, that it's an underfunded and underappreciated resource. And so, that's one of the challenges I think the groups have, is to keep supporting that activity and that close ties with the community. And that it needs to be elevated as a kind of key plank of what's going on. And I think to some extent, the organizations themselves undervalue that. And I'll say a little bit more about that. And then I think another issue is that we built the community development field, as you said, some portion of it focused on building and can be credited with the physical transformation of New York City, which is nothing short of miraculous for those of us who were around in the 80s. And yet, we can't really count and say much about what's happened to the people that were in the neighborhoods then and who are there now. And we need to get better at that, at kind of tracking what is happening with people as the organizations are working much more on building human capital. And I feel like that's a big challenge for us in this era that we work in, where outcomes are what's paid for, and where there's movement towards social investing, social impact investing, and it's got to be top of mind now for all of us. And then I think the third big challenge is one that we've had probably since our origins, which is around having a really good counterparty in government. Communities care about neighborhoods. We focus, that's our unit of concern. But there's not really an agency or place in government that has that exact concern. We keep learning over and over again that city planning really focuses on zoning. And HPD necessarily focuses first and foremost on housing. And then when the groups are talking to SBS, they're all about jobs. And when we're talking to TASC, it's all about after-school programming. But the sum and the collection of all those things is what is it? It's greater than the sum of the parts. That's what the benefits are from the community development. So I feel like we need that, and it should be in the mayor's office, because we need accountability across agencies. We need to bring all those players to the table to work on the outcomes that we all care about, and we have to have someone to talk to in government, and I feel like that's one of the challenges that we are facing. And so the Change Capital Fund, which is occupying most of my time these days, is a group of 17 donors that is working to support 5 of the city's strongest community development organizations, and many are here. Jack represents one of them, the Settlement Apartments, and Michelle, I see that the Fifth Avenue Committee, and here from Phoenix. We also are working with Brownsville Partnership and Cypress Hills LLC. Are you back there too? Hi. And we are investing in the organizations to look at how they can move forward on those things that are challenges, how we can be more outcome-oriented, how we can be more performance-driven, how we can, operationalize the ideas that we know that to get a kid out of poverty or a family out of poverty takes multi-service interventions. But still right now, some of us don't know if the people in our housing are using our programs, or if the people in our programs are living in our housing, and want to be able to figure out how to put those things together to really operationalize those sort of multi-service strategy that we need. So we are just in our first year with that, and we hope that that will generate learning for the broader field, and also look to work more closely with government and to bring them more into the conversation about what
So I'm supposed to ask you some kind of synthesizing question at this moment, and it's a little challenging. But one of the things that I'm wondering about, because the second when you raise the issue of data, and there's a cost to data, and it brings up how do we know something in planning, and how do we make judgments? And I feel like very often we're kind of thwarted by the administration saying, well, the science isn't so good on this, and not believing the words or believing the experience of somebody who's engaged every single day on the street and doing something. And yet, okay, so let's try and meet the data requests. There's a cost to that. And I wonder about how we think about allocating our scarce resources, because inevitably it comes down to that. Just a little footnote to this, so Jack took me around the school, right? And what's striking about it is not that they just built a school or they work with somebody to build a school. It's the incorporation of best practice into absolutely every corner of that school, whether it was in nutrition, whether it was providing on-site health care, whether it was looking at how to, take this green roof and urban agricultural roof and weave it through the programming. And there's a cost to that. It just, the transaction cost is just greater. And I wonder how you think about, so you can do best practice, you can figure out how we're going to have the best nutrition in this cafeteria, or we can gather data. And I'm wondering how you think about, or how you allocate, how you make decisions about the allocation of your resources when you're trying to build up this ecosystem. And is that, stop there.
I think first of all, you take cues from the folks in the community. What are they needing at that very moment? Sometimes, we're being presented with issues that are on the ground that we know are not ripe for sort of the policymaking process. And so then you have to engage in a conversation with them about what is it that we need in the campaign that we're about to undertake. And if the issue that's confronting people at that particular point in time is one that we don't have enough data and we don't have enough power on our own to sort of convince the policymakers that we're going to be able to come out with the win that we need to satisfy whatever the challenge is, then you may have to sort of recalibrate your timeline in terms of when you get to that win, because you're going to have to build in the necessity for building this data. The thing that I often say about data is that, I won't tell you what I say about it, but anyway. I think most times when sort of policymakers are saying that, they're often not in the best position to make that judgment. And it becomes this kind of
judgment about
the fact that the science isn't saying that such and such. That has become over time, I think, one of those sort of reflex responses that policymakers engage in to sort of push back or delay or not necessarily become accountable for the big headache that you're bringing to their doorstep. And so the first thing that I think has to be done with that response is to really understand, is that really true or not? Because I have found that more often than not, there is a lot of data on a lot of things, and especially about our communities, because they have often been studied ad nauseum over and over again. And so I think maybe it's just about sort of dusting off the study that was done. Hopefully it wasn't done too many years ago, usually it isn't. And making that apparent to the person who's saying, oh, but the science doesn't support that. Well, no, here are 6 studies that say to the contrary, right? And so that you're not necessarily losing the time in the scientific endeavor, or the research endeavor, whether it's social science or whatever it is, to answer this this data question that folks are often saying. But if indeed it is true that the science doesn't support that, then yes, I think we in communities, because our policymaking process is built upon sort of data in so many ways, we do have to, I think, make some effort to engage in getting that data. And the challenge for us as communities, as I said at the very outset, is how critical is the problem that's being faced by the community. If it is indeed something that is life or death, then I think the onus becomes upon us exercising more muscle and taking more power back in this process to say, you know what, this is a life and death question, and therefore we cannot wait for the scientific process or the social science research process to gather all the facts. We need a precautionary approach. And we are demanding that that precautionary approach be taken now, because what is happening is clearly not in the best interest of our society. And if you can't recognize that, then we've got whatever trail of evidence, unfortunately, to bring to your doorstep just to make it clear to you. I think it's at that point that we have to push back to government and say, suspension of this request for data, precautionary approach is necessary at this point in time. And if you want to keep this job, then you need to act.
Other responses or?
I've thought about using data to actually try to set the goals as well as to respond to the problem. And I think one thing that's been obvious is that Picky Bean has a charge, right? It's 80,000 new, 120,000 preserved, 200,000 by the end of 10 years. And what we don't have is a lot of other numbers about neighborhoods. And I think it would be a game changer to have the city and community groups be working together to develop sort of neighborhood dashboards that we're trying to move the needle on. How many kids are sitting in one classroom? How many kids graduate? How many kids end up in jail? How many affordable apartments are lost? How many people are winding up in shelter in this neighborhood? If we had those things as equally emphatic and public and transparent as goals as we do number of units, I think it could change the conversation between neighborhoods and the city government. So, again, that's something I hope that will keep pushing and make inroads towards, through the Change Capital Fund, but also in the broader field as in the dialogue now with zoning and the other things we're coming out with.
I just want to pick up something that Douglas said, and maybe then turn it over to you all about whether or not there is a tension between having robust institutions and community control. And I know there's something wrong with this thinking, that the more robust, the larger. And it's something being placed at risk. And now we've described sort of different levels of different natures of expertise that we have to have. And maybe it's just that we're starving the sector, but that to get to a point where we have this type of neighborhood data, to get to a point where we can make informed decisions in a rapid way, there has to be sort of this infrastructure that's gathering the information, that's constantly in touch. And I'm just wondering about the scale, and is there a trade-off, is there a sacrifice between robust, effective institutions and the size of the institution and the nature of control in that institution?
Two thoughts. I think on the data piece, and again, wearing both hats in a lot of ways, but just like the New Yorker hat. I do feel like, even in my time at AFI, this need for investment in infrastructure and internal capacity is such a struggle. And even though AFI is a pretty large scale, multi-work organization, resources around housing folks every day, keeping the lights on, getting those loans out there, helping small businesses. And so, can you hire an analytics manager? Can you hire some data entry folks? Can you invest in a very expensive database to actually link together your paper case management files, your DYC client reporting that you do online, and the paper or the Word document foundation outcomes that other funders look for. I think it was always very challenging to operationalize and even try to think that way. I think the one area, where organizations are able to make that connection is when kind of funders are investing in that capacity. Whether funders are actually creating those databases, funders are putting investments in organizations and requiring them to think strategically about knowledge and about outcomes, not just outputs. And so I think when you're working in an organization, you kind of just grit your teeth. You're like, okay, I know this is good for our work. I know this is good for the organization. Yes, we'll do it. But just as I think CDC's big and small struggle to find resources to kind of do that work, funders also struggle to find resources because they know it's important. And funders are really correct me if I'm wrong. But it's also, they also have to raise the funds to make sure that those investments are being made. Because on both sides of the table, we all know that this is how we really move the needle and really do better work in our communities. I think a side note on that too is, I think that kind of points to Cecil's point. As a CDC, like Kathy, that was working in immigrant communities, a lot of times the data didn't always tell the story that we saw. So, or the data just wasn't out there because it was disaggregated based on ethnicity or kind of the many dynamics of like immigration history. So we often had to kind of tell our own stories, do our own surveys. Sometimes I felt like we're serving our communities. It takes a lot of capacity for a CDC that might be large and do a lot of programmatic work or housing development, but not really have a lot of kind of technical capacity. And so we can lean on research institutions, but that also takes time and resources to get free labor too. So there's always those trade-offs. I think like to add another point about the local organization robustness. I actually don't think it's I don't think it's a trade-off. Actually, I think that when I've had chances to go out to California, I realized that there are affordable housing developers that aren't based in neighborhoods. There's like national ones that build housing in neighborhoods all over the country or all over the state, and I thought it was really interesting. Coming from New York context, I just didn't know that could happen. But that work is important. But I think also small organizations or organizations that are very much rooted in their communities aren't putting up six-story buildings all the time, are also very robust. I think that I think for me it goes back to kind of what I was thinking about earlier is, what are the choices that we make as organizations in terms of the resources we have, the mission that we inherited and that we breathed, but then how that translates into day-to-day work, into program development, into putting those resources in the budget. And so many organizations invest, like you said, in leadership development, and that's so other organizations do leadership development less, develop physical development more, policy advocacy more, and that's also valuable. And so really it really comes around, I often found around mutual learning and working in coalition. So even at AFI and it's part of a national network of other Asian and Pacific Islander-led CDCs all over the country. Some folks are 4 years old, some folks are 5 years old, but it was really around learning robustness. One of our colleagues is here from China, and it doesn't really matter because everyone kind of finds that value that we bring, and sometimes that work that we do together, we don't identify what that value is together, and not just like one person doing something around eating and someone else doing something in Florida, and like everyone talking to each other.
Anyone want to jump in, ask a question? Funders reacting to the data issue?
I think that the only funder that should be focusing on the big picture of the data issue is the city of New York. I think that, I think back to 15 years ago when I tried to get some census data and I had to get a goddamn printout on a DOS machine and look at, my census tract and log and everything else and do all this crap, and it's really hard. And now I go into the Department of City Planning and I can go to Oasis and I can get all the stuff. And so I think actually the data, and I think your point about precautionary and stuff, I think that is I think the show me the data is the I don't want to deal with you answer, because there is no data to support the prevailing notion of the opinion that they're pushing forward, that you're trying to counter. There is no data that says the way we're doing it is the right way. So if you ask for the data that validates the approach, there is nothing. So, however, there are a lot of data points, and I think Wendy's point of choosing simple data points, graduation rates and attendance and other things, there is so much stuff collected. And we are judging, however, those government officials on these things, so that information is not as transparent and available to us. If it was if I could go to DOE and get as much information as I can get from Oasis, and I can get a lot of information on the schools. I can get the number of kids getting lunch, I can get all this other stuff. So I would say that the funder part for the private foundations for us is to be able to have somebody that can work with data, but the data collection has to be at these agencies, at the schools, at the police department, at the things, and these are starting to come out, and I think that's where it has to happen, because if people in the neighborhood are going to do anything, they're going to have to just get an Excel, and they're going to pull the data, and they're going to put it out. They're not going to have some big-ass program to do it, you know. And if government...
And that's a technical term, big ass program.
Yeah, because you have a DYCD contract to provide after-school programs, or you have an SBS contract to assist people, and you have $0 for any admin to deal with this issue. And so, if they're going to give us $0, okay, then they have to spend the dollars to put it out there, and then I don't have to have it internally to do it, you know? That's the only way we're going to be able to do it. It's too big. There's too many resources that are just frittered away in other things. That's what it is.
I was thinking about, in some cases, we have to start from the beginning and anticipate this question. So I'm from Los Gatos in the Bronx, and we're starting a broadband initiative in our buildings. So we're starting with our first one of 18 buildings where we're working with a private organization that is sort of building it in. Our theory is with greater access to the most vulnerable to this technology, being able to connect with us, we should get better interaction, better forward activity, less lapse in time, you can follow up and yada, yada, yada. So what we're doing is we're testing our assumptions going in. So we're doing our little, first half of the building, sort of laying it out and then doing the pre and post. So I guess to your point is, it starts to make it part of our practice to develop the data from the very beginning, because in anticipation of the pushback, when we go to the next whoever, and we say, okay, look, we tested it in this building, now we want to expand it from 150 to 4,000. Well, then we're going to have to be equipped with data that shows, response time, follow-up time, use and benefits are all there, or else we could have sort of that blockage. So I think the reality is that whatever side it may be, it forces us to make that part of our planning going forward. Do people surveys.
Can I also say a couple of things? I think there's this whole thing for me about building civic musculature. Data is not the province of researchers. We have been taught to think that way. And so my community organization's standpoint, when we talk about data, we're often talking about community-based participatory research. We are trying to involve, this is a process and a part of the way that we cultivate leadership, right? Because just as we have been separated from policy, we have been separated from science and the tools and research, right? It's not just bench science, but social science as well. And that has become the province of experts. Well, some of the greatest experts on any issue impacting someone in a community are people who live in that community, yet that expertise is devalued. And so part of the work that we're doing is also about reclaiming that power as well. And so the notion of figuring out how we engage people in sort of collecting data and telling that story that is their story is also critically important. And then the other thing that I'll say is that I think is a part of building that musculature, because you often hear that we are not a scientifically literate society. And I think that's true to a certain extent, for sure. So let's do something about it. Let's make sure that people have more access to that, and that science isn't this sort of misty thing, right? That sort of is like, oh, it comes out from heaven, and then, these ordained people are suddenly the ones who know it all. Because the truth about science, the truth about research is that it's an ever-changing body of knowledge. What we know today will be different than what we know tomorrow. And that's why I think it becomes important for us to be able to push back and say, with this data question, exactly right. Show me your data that says this is the way it should be. Show me the data that says that the person who has more power and access to the system gets to do what they want without that request to show the data, right? Because that is what happens, right? And so I think that's an important thing to also put into the mix of the process.
values and who has power, you know, and why somebody is legitimate.
All
Do
right,
it.
so my question is, I wonder if the panelists could reflect on what is our stance now towards the private sector? And I ask that because, to me, when the community development movement, the CDC movement started, the thing that distinguished us from so many other movements was that we had this special relationship, this sort of tug and pull with the private sector, meaning that in neighborhoods where the private sector was gone, there was a vacuum, we stepped in and said, we're going to use the tools of the private sector to build housing, to build supermarkets, to do whatever needs to be done. Now, the private sector is back in many of those communities, and so I'm just curious to know what people think about our new relationship with the private sector.
Great question. To start that one.
Don't go first.
I'm waiting for this.
Well, I think one thing we could talk about is what's happening with around CDC4G. So when Mayor Koch unveiled his housing plan, as Pat said, it was for developers of last resort, and then the city really stepped in and actually enabled community development corporations to get their legs by creating standardized programs to use to invest in housing and to learn to get their jobs. Now, 30 years later, the de Blasio housing plan has really got squeezing in affordable housing to a very, very hot real estate market, and the nonprofits have been losing market share. I mean, the for-profits figured out that you can make a whole lot of money on housing development when it's subsidized, and so some strong groups again in this room got together. There's 12 groups. They created something called some people like to call it CDC4G. I mean, let's call it the Joint Ownership Entity, Joe, which are working together to actually pool their assets so that they can compete and gain back market share with private developers who are able to get city deals because they have big balance sheets. The nonprofits actually own billions of dollars of assets, and so by pooling them, they become a bigger fish in the pond. And also the other issue has been that affordable housing that's been owned by nonprofits that's struggling have been sold to for-profits, and there's a lot of concern around that because we're losing affordable housing, longevity. The groups that are mission-driven have really been the ones to keep housing affordable over time. So CDC4G provides another out for a troubled portfolio where there's a nonprofit owner that can assume management. And it also, according to Foresight Advisors projections, actually there's economies of scale that can increase the cash flow from those buildings. And it's pretty exciting. I think it's a big game changer for the nonprofit developers, and it changes their ability to compete. And we'll see what happens. There's the first group apparently committed their first 800 units to the joint ownership entity, and it seems to be moving forward. So that would be one way that we're having a new relationship with the private sector.
Yeah, where we're located in Mount Eden, I mean, we're right in the heart of one of the areas that's to be rezoned. It's a 75-block area along Jerome Avenue, spanning multiple neighborhoods, so it's not one neighborhood. And Department of City Planning, I guess maybe inadvertently, when they first announced this plan, called it the Cromwell-Jerome Neighborhood Study. And nobody ever heard of Cromwell-Jerome neighborhood. We know Highbridge and Mount Eden and Hope and University Heights. But I think the question about private sector can't be separated from the question about the role of city government in our mind, and what is being done by government to incentivize the private sector coming into the neighborhood in a way that doesn't necessarily best serve the interests of the neighborhood. We talk about what's affordable housing, and people say, 60% of AMI. Well, what is that? 60% of AMI is like $55,000 a year for a family of four, I think. And in Community Board 4 are located, 100% of AMI is $27,000 a year. So who is the housing going to be built for, and how do we ensure that the housing is built for people who live in the neighborhood, who are already overcrowded, have excessive rent burden, are living in shelters, living double up and triple up. So I think that's one thing that we're kind of grappling with. But I mean, one of the things we're involved in is organizing a coalition that's really focusing on this issue and demanding that there be a community vision and that there's a voice for people living in the community and have been invested there for many, many years, so that they are there. So we hear back, from some folks at HPD or the Borough President's Office is that, well, if we don't build housing for people with considerably higher income, then families who are making $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year are going to leave the neighborhood. And it brings us back to this question of data. We say, where's the data to support that? And is this anecdotal, or is there data that suggests that's really going to happen? At New Settlement, the 1,022 units, when families move in, the rent that they pay is determined in relationship with their income is at that point in time. And our goal is to have nobody paying, frankly, more than 25% of their income. I mean, this 30% of income for rent is a significant burden for people with very low income, right? And then, once families move in, if a year later their income has doubled, their rent isn't going to change. I mean, it's part of how we have tried to ensure that there is, economic diversity within the community, that is stability, that people stay, that, kids who are living in families with $20,000 a year income are having the opportunity to, meet and see and, live side by side with families who might have, $85,000 a year income, and maybe two people working on, in jobs in civil service or nonprofits. So it's kind of rambling response, but I think it's one of them.
I think part of Pat's question is every neighborhood is marketable now, right? And do we think what Myriad described as the partnership strategy before, in order to induce people to come into the neighborhood and build, is that viable? Or is it really that we have to proceed on two separate tracks? And how could we ever begin to overcome sort of the difference in resources, the difference in market? Ooh. I see somebody who wants to
So I think about this from a very different vantage point, right? I'm not a person who, when I go to work every day, is building houses or building supermarkets in my community. But I am building other parts of capital. I'm organizing with people. I'm working on issues around environment and environmental health and the way that land is used in our community. For me, this equation about, or how do I think about sort of, the private sector, which is where I believe Pat's question started. I think that what I think about that, or what we think about that collectively, is not really, I don't know how to say this, I don't think it's that critical to be focused on what we think about it. I think it's more important for us to figure out how do we transform the private sector so that its construction of what the bottom line is for them is fundamentally different and tied back into the ecosystem that they are a part of, yet live separate and independently in, right? And what I mean by that is there are people who are engaged in creating sort of like these B corporations. It's a whole movement around sort of what it means to define through the tax code what a corporate and private sector entity is. And I think some of that thinking needs to be translated into this sphere. Because so much of what, and again, I'm not the housing maven, I'm really not, but so much of the way this whole paradigm has shifted is like, we have to go to them because they have the money and government doesn't. Well, there's something else that government has, which is the tools to define the corporate entity and its practice and how it sort of it thinks about what a bottom line is. In this B corporation structure, there are things that are definable as sort of social goods. These corporate entities must be responsible for keeping a meter on, right? Now, some of that I think I might be wrong is kind of some of what was thought of when the whole Community Reinvestment Act piece was done, right? But I think that that's not enough, because I feel as though it's not enough because it doesn't require the sort of private and corporate developer to think more critically about if you're allowed to have this sort of like LLC or whatever it is that you have, they are not necessarily required to think about this good. It's only about what their bottom line is. So what shifts that? And to me, in my sort of, little sphere of the world, it's got to be like how their tax code is structured. I mean, there's got to be something that's done differently that they understand. That if you want to be a corporate actor that does this kind of development in our communities, then you get structured under this particular code. And this means that you have to do these kinds of things in a way that's not sucking the life out of the community. It's not sucking the resources or creating these incredible imbalances of power between government and these individual corporations or corporate entities. I mean, this is housing. I mean, this is one of the more fundamental things. This is not like a pair of jeans or something. This is housing. So, I mean, I don't know if that's socialism or anything, but is that what that is? Oh, I didn't say that. But that's what I think about it. I mean, I just feel like fundamentally those relationships have to change in some way.
So there's some folks in the room who've done some business ventures under the nonprofit umbrella. Do you want to reflect on your experience? Because what the challenge, I think, with the B Corps is, yes, they're going to have the high road may cost more, and so there may be an unfair advantage when they get on the market. And how do we equalize that unfair, and how do we address those unfair competitive advantages? Because fundamentally, we're still out in the market. I mean, not apart from housing, if it's a supermarket or anything else, how do we sort of get to the level playing field?
Let's make that the opportunity, not the challenge.
Okay. Friendly amendment. Fifth Avenue's experience in
business ventures. I think Pat's question is a very good one. And I do think that the relationship that CDCs have with the private sector has evolved. And that I think as the market has heated up, we're less inviting to the private sector and more focused on the accountability pieces. And it doesn't mean that you're not still partnering on the other side of something. But I think we're more wary. I think we know what the market, unleashing of the market can bring out, and are very, very I think Cecil's point is a great one, and I think that the whole issue, if you take your example and bring it to the housing world, and so if you allow the market forces to be unleashed, the government allows that to happen, or facilitates that, and then it causes additional costs to the public sector as a result, then that should be part of what is understood to be happening, and that needs to be paid for, whether it's increasing homelessness or the infrastructure costs or whatever it is, that we know that will happen as a result of government action allowing unfettered access of the market. So it's not just controlling, it's obviously doing the proper cost analysis. In fact, that has a range of, we have pure for-profit entities, we have obviously pure nonprofit entities, and it's all about, and even the for-profit obviously have multiple bottom lines. And for us, it's always about figuring out whatever the appropriate corporate structure is to try to achieve the broadest goals possible to advance our mission. There's definitely a lot of different ways to do that.
I know Nepal was signaling me, but I don't know what that signal means. 10 minutes before people can drink? Okay. So it's very your answer is like very reminiscent. How do we internalize negative external costs, like in environmental decisions, you know, somebody's using a coal, is burning coal, right? And it has all these external costs, and how do we internalize that? It's this, but on a much, much, much smaller, intimate scale. And the idea of using B Corps as a tax structure may allow us to do some of that market fine-tuning.
You know, see, we have ill-defined the situation. When we look back and we talk about the Koch plan, Mayor Koch did not have a number, okay? Mayor Koch was like MASH, okay, where the body came from the battlefield, and it was about dealing with the neighborhoods that we were dealing with that were battlefields. And what we put in there was not going to cure that person per se, but it was going to make them stable and move forward. Okay, and there was no number, there was no context, and so it was about trying to change the neighborhood, which was horrible, and the people that were there were struggling to try and work it. It wasn't like they were horrible; it was that they were in a battlefield. Okay. And so when we started to commodify what we're doing, when we started to count everything, then it became easy to change the housing from being a place changer, which is what it was. And I'm not trying to, you know, this isn't rainbows and unicorns back in the Koch era, okay? There was some nasty stuff going on, okay? But when we started to commodify it and say it's about producing the housing itself as a good, okay, then it allowed us to count the housing without doing what Michelle was asking, which is what is the impact of that housing, or prove that the creation is good and is it place changing. But then what Jack is doing is he's having to justify getting extra money to make a difference in the school system, or make a difference in the neighborhood. Because we have to somehow show the economic benefit of saving people from going to prison. It's cheaper to put them in permanent housing than in shelter. But I'm just, you know, so I think what we have to do is we have to go back and say, just doing housing is not good. That it has to be, if the housing is going to be in Jack's neighborhood, then how is it contributing to that good and qualify with the other aspects? And I think that is what's happening when it comes to the community schools issue and some of these other things. And I think that would change some of what we are. I mean, I'm a houser. I build housing. I know about that stuff, you know. But if we stop saying just because I got my bean counter right, it's good, then we can start to change, and that may be part of the argument that we have to do with our community, that just producing is not good. And I'll produce it, but I'll produce it just to get it enough, but that's
To go directly to a question though, I think we do need to control private interest in this game, period. I mean, that's where we are now, what we're looking at. Some of our developments reaching that 15-year end of tax window, and the idea is really around the CDC 4G model. It's like maintain nonprofit ownership, so it's not driven by the commodity of housing, but it really is about preserving a sector of the neighborhood that's always going to be there for folks who aren't doing 60,000 and better. If we don't do that, then we're failing like so much of us. I think it's about getting the private sector away from affordable housing as far as we can. But we can't do it without it, because we just had another conversation with a private organization yesterday about the next deal. So it's like you get them in their vehicle, but I think for us as a CDC, we're looking at them as the vehicle now, as opposed to them seeing us as the vehicle. And really having that clear negotiation of, okay, how long are you in here, and how do we get you out? And the first item of negotiation is right of first refusal. So that way when it's time to sell, nothing happens until this entity has its say. because it's in the structure and that we can protect it.
What do you call them back there? What does that mean? I can't read it from here. You gotta use the 20-point
We
font.
went over this, Adam.
I know
It means you're a star.
Sarah Green has a question, and then we're going for drinks.
This is to follow up on what Wendy said, but this is for the whole panel. Have there been any efforts to track all of the people who have been displaced from these neighborhoods all over years? Does anybody know if there are any efforts to do that? And actually, can I just add something that I think one thing that's interesting is when you hear people talk about the latest income statistics, you never hear anybody say that there are fewer people who are low income in this city. So where are people going? Are they leaving? It sounds like those
No, right. Or it's the suburbanization of poverty. You know, the rings are getting poorer.
But are we having a net loss of is your city having a net loss of low income people the way other cities in the US have had?
No.
It's unclear.
Go off the radar.
You're off the radar. Yeah. Right. But nobody's tracking that.
Eureka's trying
So,
to.
I mean, I guess the answer is no, right? We haven't seen a net loss of low-income population. In fact, it's a question of, are we compounding the problem over the long term? Because while we talk about sort of planning NYC and the projected populations incoming, there also isn't a conversation about the big chunk of that projected future population over the next few years that is supposed to be low income. And then also the big chunk of our current population that will be seniors that will increasingly become low income because they are on fixed income. So that share is actually going to escalate, not decrease over time. And so that's sort of a question of what are, not just in terms of but in terms of communities and where people are going to be and how much they're going to be doubled up and how much they're going to be sort of struggling both in terms of the housing affordability side but also the income affordability side, really creating a future recipe of
And I believe there was something new from Furman today.
Today,
Does anyone want to comment on it?
I will say that we put out a report today looking at the capacity for additional density to support the creation of affordable housing, and it relates to all these conversations. It varies dramatically across neighborhoods. There are still neighborhoods. There's a lot of capacity, and obviously there are a lot of areas with high rents. So there's a lot of capacity, and there's neighborhoods where rents are still not high enough to support development, let alone have that development support affordable housing. So there still is need for subsidies of affordable housing developers.
So the headline was slightly different. It seemed to question the strategy, the integrity of the strategy. Yeah. Of doing the
There were some
management.
sensationalistic headlines in the press today about our report. This is so much that it's the plans that there's been a lot of focus on, inclusionary zoning as the answer.
Right.
And I think people in this room understand, have always understood that inclusionary zoning is one tool, but it's not the answer, right? So that was really important. But I think we've done at the Pratt Center, we've done, we have a lot of data. And we've done we're saying it's not that people have left the city, and hopefully they won't, hopefully we'll solve this problem. That's one of the worst fears, right? That the city will run away dramatic change and who's living here. But, I think that's why we see rent burdens skyrocketing. That's why we see the homeless population skyrocketing. Triple that. That's how people are living. So
And the challenge in the interim is kind of, this is like classic planner's blight. We've now said we're going to do this. What's going to happen in the interim until the market, if ever, catches up like that? And it goes to the dashboard suggestion earlier about how, the ripple of speculation in displacement is just, moving through neighborhoods.
The dashboard at the neighborhood level.
Yes.
Because I thought that
Yes.
was,
Yes.
that was fundamentally an important tool for local people to be able to regain the tools to hold accountable people that are making some of these policies. I really appreciated that. Thank you.
So with that, thank you.